Lieutenant Colonel Ahmed saw the flash before he heard the explosion, then another, then 5 more in rapid succession. His radio erupted with screaming voices, panicked reports of tanks exploding in the darkness with no warning, no muzzle flashes, no enemy in sight. The sandstorm reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. His Soviet advisors had promised him this weather would be his advantage. They were wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 27, 1991, along a stretch of Kuwaiti desert that would become known as Medina Ridge, the Iraqi Republican Guard was about to learn a lesson that Soviet propaganda had spent decades denying. The lesson would be taught in fire and steel, delivered by an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hit, and couldn't understand. It would last approximately 3 hours. When it ended, 186 Iraqi tanks and armored vehicles would be burning wrecks scattered across the sand. The Americans would lose exactly 0 tanks to enemy fire. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution, and it began with a lie that Soviet military doctrine had been telling its clients for over 20 years. For decades, the Soviet Union had built its tank doctrine on a simple philosophy that they called brutally efficient, and their critics called criminally negligent. Quantity over quality, mass production over sophistication, weapons so simple that a conscript with basic training could operate them. The T-72 main battle tank embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was designed to be manufactured by the thousands, maintained with basic tools, and operated by crews with minimal technical education. Soviet propaganda materials proudly proclaimed this as a virtue. Western tanks, they said, were overcomplicated toys built by engineers who had never seen real combat. The Americans in particular were mocked for their obsession with electronics, computers, and what Soviet manuals dismissively called bourgeois optical systems. The M1 Abrams tank became a favorite target of this mockery. Soviet military export documentation, distributed to client states throughout the Middle East and Africa, contained detailed analysis of American armor weaknesses. The Abrams, these manuals claimed, was a maintenance nightmare. Its gas turbine engine required constant service. Its sophisticated fire control system would fail in desert heat. Most importantly, its thermal imaging sites were described as fragile electronic equipment that would be useless in the dust, sand, and extreme temperatures of Middle Eastern warfare. The manuals specifically stated that in conditions of poor visibility, sandstorms, or smoke, American technological advantages would evaporate. In those conditions, victory would go to whoever saw the enemy first and fired first. And in close-range engagements, the manuals promised, Soviet firepower would dominate. This wasn't just propaganda for public consumption. This was doctrine. This was what tank commanders were taught, what battle plans were based on, what gave confidence to crews who would face American armor. And it was backed by seemingly solid technical specifications. The T-72's main gun, a 125mm smoothbore cannon, could fire armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds designated APFSDS. According to Soviet documentation, these rounds could penetrate the frontal armor of any NATO main battle tank at ranges between 1,500 and 2,000 meters. Even the vaunted M1 Abrams, the manuals assured, could be defeated at normal combat distances. Iraq had believed every word. When Saddam Hussein's regime purchased hundreds of T-72 tanks from the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s, they received not just the hardware, but the doctrine that came with it. Soviet military advisors trained Iraqi crews in Soviet tactics. Tank commanders studied in Soviet military academies. The Republican Guard, Iraq's elite armored force, was equipped with the T-72M1, an export variant specifically designed for foreign sale. These weren't the top-of-the-line models that Soviet forces used, but downgraded versions that Moscow called monkey models in internal communications. Still, Iraqi commanders were assured they had effective weapons. They had numerical superiority. They had proven Soviet technology. And most importantly, they had a defensive strategy that Soviet doctrine promised would neutralize American advantages. The plan for defending Kuwait from the American ground offensive was built on this doctrine. Iraqi armored divisions would dig into prepared defensive positions. They would use the terrain, the weather, and their knowledge of local conditions to ambush advancing American forces. When sandstorms reduced visibility to nothing, When American technology supposedly failed, Iraqi tanks would emerge from concealment at close range and destroy the blind Americans before they could react. First shot, first kill. Soviet Doctrine 101. What the Iraqis didn't know, what Soviet intelligence had completely failed to understand, was that the Americans had changed the rules of tank warfare so fundamentally that Soviet doctrine had become obsolete before the first shot was fired. The changes weren't just incremental improvements. They were revolutionary advantages that created an asymmetry so extreme that it transformed battle into slaughter. The first revolution was thermal imaging. The AN/VSG-2 tank thermal sight installed in M1A1 Abrams tanks didn't work like human eyes or traditional optics. It didn't need visible light. It detected infrared radiation, the heat signature that every object emits. A tank engine, even one that had been shut off for hours, glowed like a beacon in thermal sight. Exhaust pipes, crew compartments, ammunition storage, all radiated heat that thermal imaging could detect at distances exceeding 3,000 meters. Darkness didn't matter, smoke didn't matter, and critically, sandstorms didn't matter. Sand particles might block visible light, but they were nearly transparent to the infrared spectrum. What looked like impenetrable zero-visibility conditions to the human eye looked like clear daylight through thermal optics. Soviet tank designers knew thermal imaging existed. They simply couldn't replicate it. The sophisticated sensor arrays required advanced semiconductor manufacturing capabilities that Soviet industry had never developed. The USSR had focused its electronics sector on military applications like missiles and radar, not on the kind of miniaturized, mass-produced thermal sensors that Western militaries were installing in thousands of vehicles. Soviet tanks used image intensifiers, devices that amplified available light. These worked reasonably well at night if there was moonlight or starlight to amplify. In a sandstorm, they were completely useless. The technology gap was so severe that Soviet military planners simply assumed thermal imaging would be too unreliable for real combat conditions. Their export manuals reflected this wishful thinking by describing thermal sights as fragile equipment that would fail when it mattered most. The second revolution was fire control. The M1A1's ballistic computer integrated data from multiple sensors in real time. A laser rangefinder measured exact distance to target. Wind sensors measured crosswind. Tilt sensors measured the tank's angle. Temperature sensors measured air density. All of this data fed into a computer that calculated the precise trajectory needed to hit a target. The gun itself was stabilized by a gyroscopic system that kept it on target even while the tank was moving at 40 miles per hour across rough terrain. An Abrams could fire accurately on the move, something that Soviet doctrine considered nearly impossible and therefore didn't emphasize in training. T-72 crews were taught to stop, aim, and fire. American crews could do all three simultaneously. The third revolution, the one that Soviet intelligence had completely missed, was armor. The original M1 Abrams had used British-designed Chobham armor, a composite of ceramic layers that was significantly more effective than traditional steel armor. But in the months before Desert Storm, a classified upgrade was applied to Abrams tanks being shipped to the Gulf. The so-called heavy armor package, designated HA, incorporated a mesh of depleted uranium into the composite armor array. Depleted uranium is extraordinarily dense, nearly twice as dense as lead. When integrated into armor, it created a barrier that could defeat kinetic energy penetrators that would slice through steel like paper. The upgrade was so secret that even some American units didn't know about it. Soviet intelligence certainly didn't know. Their penetration estimates for the T-72's APFSDS rounds were based on data about baseline Chobham armor. Those estimates were already optimistic. Against the HA package with depleted uranium, they were catastrophically wrong. Soviet testing had indicated that their best APFSDS rounds could penetrate approximately 400 to 450 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent at combat ranges. This was enough to defeat most NATO tanks of the 1970s and early 80s. It was not enough to defeat M1A1 HA frontal armor, which provided protection equivalent to 600 to 700 millimeters of rolled homogeneous armor. The gap was so large that even at point-blank range, even with a perfect 90-degree impact angle, Soviet rounds couldn't penetrate. They would hit, they would create a black scorch mark, and they would bounce off or shatter. The crew inside the Abrams wouldn't even feel a significant jolt. Meanwhile, American M829A1 Sabot rounds could penetrate over 550 millimeters of armor at 2,000 meters. T-72 frontal armor provided roughly 280 to 380 millimeters of protection depending on the variant. American rounds went through Iraqi tanks like they weren't there. The penetrator would punch through the front armor, travel through the crew compartment at supersonic speed, and often exit through the rear armor. If it hit ammunition storage, which in the T-72 was stored in a carousel directly under the turret with no blast protection, the tank would explode so violently that the turret would be blown completely off the hull. Abrams crews learned to recognize this signature: a bright flash, a tower of flame, and the turret flipping end over end through the air. The fourth advantage was training. Average American tank crews had spent over 300 hours in sophisticated simulators before deploying to the Gulf. They had practiced engaging multiple targets at long range. They had practiced firing on the move. They had practiced target identification through thermal sights until it became instinctive. Iraqi crews, trained in Soviet doctrine, focused on basic mechanical operation and short-range engagement. Soviet training philosophy emphasized quantity of trained crews over quality of training. Get them competent enough to operate the vehicle and fire the gun, then move on to training the next batch. Advanced tactics were reserved for elite units. But even Iraq's Republican Guard, supposedly elite, had training that focused on Soviet-style warfare: mass formations, coordinated movement, overwhelming firepower at close range. None of it prepared them for an enemy who could see them from 3 kilometers away in zero visibility and kill them before they knew the enemy was there. By late February 1991, the ground war had been underway for 3 days. The initial assault had shattered Iraq's forward defenses faster than anyone anticipated. American and coalition forces were driving deep into Kuwait and southern Iraq, racing to cut off and destroy Iraqi forces before they could retreat. The Iraqi Republican Guard, Saddam Hussein's most capable and best-equipped units, had been positioned as a strategic reserve and counterattack force. Now they were being committed to a desperate defensive battle, trying to slow the American advance long enough for the rest of the Iraqi army to escape. The Tawakalna division of the Republican Guard was dug in along a stretch of terrain that American forces would later designate Objective Norfolk. Intelligence reports indicated a brigade-sized force of T-72 tanks and BMP infantry fighting vehicles in prepared defensive positions. The Americans would have to cross open desert to reach them, which meant the Iraqis would see them coming and could engage from prepared positions. On paper, it looked like the Iraqis had a fighting chance. Soviet doctrine said that defending forces, especially those in prepared positions with good fields of fire, had significant advantages over attackers crossing open ground. Then the weather changed. A massive sandstorm rolled across the desert, reducing visibility to almost nothing. For the Iraqi commanders, this seemed like a gift from God. The Americans would be blind. They would stumble into Iraqi defensive positions at close range. The Iraqis would have their first shot advantage. The sophisticated American technology would be neutralized by simple desert weather. Soviet doctrine had promised exactly this scenario. Everything was going according to plan. The Americans didn't slow down. The 1st Armored Division's 2nd Brigade continued advancing through the sandstorm as if it was a sunny day. Tank commanders buttoned up their hatches and switched their optics to thermal mode. What looked like impenetrable darkness to human eyes looked like clear, high-contrast imagery through thermal sights. Every Iraqi vehicle, every piece of equipment that had been warmed by the sun or by engine heat, glowed white-hot against the cold desert floor. The American formation maintained its movement speed and tactical discipline, advancing in coordinated platoons with overlapping fields of fire. At approximately 0400 hours, lead elements of the American brigade began detecting Iraqi vehicles on their thermal sights. Range: 3,000 meters. The Iraqis couldn't see anything beyond 50 meters. American tank commanders reported contacts and began designating targets. Fire control computers calculated trajectories. Gunners acquired aim points. The order to engage was given. The first volley of M829A1 Sabot rounds crossed 3 kilometers of sandstorm-obscured desert in under 2 seconds. Iraqi crews had no warning. One moment their tanks were intact, and ready for battle. The next moment, armor-piercing penetrators moving at over a mile per second punched through frontal armor, shredded internal components, and detonated ammunition. Tanks exploded from the inside out. Turrets were blown off hulls. Crew members who survived the initial penetration were killed by the ammunition fires that followed. The few who managed to escape their vehicles stumbled into the Sandstorm with no idea where the fire had come from. Iraqi commanders tried to make sense of what was happening. Radio channels filled with panicked reports. Units were being destroyed but couldn't identify enemy positions. Some crews reported muzzle flashes in the distance but couldn't determine range or location. Others reported nothing at all, just explosions appearing out of nowhere. Battalion and brigade commanders ordered their units to engage, to return fire, to suppress enemy positions. There was nothing to return fire at. The enemy was invisible. Some Iraqi tanks attempted to maneuver, to relocate to better positions or to retreat. American thermal sights tracked them effortlessly. Moving vehicles generated even stronger heat signatures than stationary ones. American gunners acquired these moving targets, led them slightly to account for their movement, and fired. The hits were devastating. Sabot rounds designed to defeat frontal armor had no difficulty penetrating side or rear armor. Tanks trying to escape exploded just as thoroughly as tanks in static positions. A few Iraqi crews, through luck or positioning, managed to acquire American tanks in their optical sights at close range. These crews did exactly what Soviet doctrine instructed. They aimed for center mass on the frontal armor. They fired their best APF-SDS rounds. They scored direct hits. And then they watched in horror as their rounds bounced off, leaving only black scorch marks on the American armor. The psychological impact was devastating. Soviet advisors had promised them that their guns could penetrate American armor at normal combat ranges. They had just scored direct hits at under 1,000 meters, sometimes under 500 meters, and achieved nothing. Meanwhile, the American tank that they had just hit was now rotating its turret toward them, with mechanical precision. Iraqi crews had perhaps 2 or 3 seconds between the moment they realized their gun was useless and the moment the American gun fired. Those 2 or 3 seconds were enough for some crews to understand what was happening. Soviet doctrine had lied. Soviet technology had failed. Soviet advisors had sent them into battle with equipment that couldn't penetrate enemy armor and couldn't survive enemy fire. They were fighting a defensive action against an enemy that could see them from distances they couldn't imagine, that could kill them before they knew they were under attack, and that they couldn't hurt even at point-blank range. The engagement wasn't a battle. It was target practice with live ammunition. The fighting at Medina Ridge lasted approximately 3 hours. When it ended, American forces had destroyed 186 Iraqi tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Not damaged, destroyed, burned out wrecks with their crews dead inside or scattered around them. The Americans lost 0 tanks to enemy fire. 1 Abrams hit an anti-tank mine and was disabled, but later recovered and repaired. Not a single American tank was penetrated by enemy fire. Not one. Iraqi crews had fired dozens, perhaps hundreds of rounds at American tanks. Every single hit either bounced off or shattered against armor that Soviet manuals had claimed could be penetrated. In the days following the battle, intelligence officers interviewed surviving Iraqi tank crews. The consistent theme in these interviews was shock and betrayal. They had been told they had effective weapons. They had been told their tanks could fight American tanks on equal terms. They had been told that in poor visibility conditions, their tactical skills and defensive positions would compensate for any American technological advantages. Everything they had been told was wrong. Some survivors reported that they had abandoned functioning tanks and fled into the desert on foot because continuing to fight was suicide. Better to surrender or disappear than to sit in a metal coffin waiting for the invisible executioner to fire. Soviet military advisors who observed or learned about the battle were equally shocked. Internal Soviet military reports from this period, some of which have since been declassified, showed genuine alarm at what had happened. The technology gap was far larger than they had estimated. Thermal imaging wasn't just an incremental advantage. It was a revolutionary capability that fundamentally changed the nature of armored warfare. And the armor protection gap was even worse. Soviet testing and estimates had been wrong by such a large margin. that it raised questions about either the quality of Soviet intelligence or the honesty of Soviet military industry in reporting test results. Export manuals that had promised clients their T-72 tanks could defeat NATO armor at normal combat ranges were now revealed as either wildly optimistic or deliberately fraudulent. Moscow immediately began requesting intelligence on the exact composition of M1A1HA armor. They never obtained it. American security around the depleted uranium upgrade was tight. Soviet intelligence services tried multiple approaches to acquire details. None succeeded. All they could determine was that American armor was far more effective than their estimates, but they couldn't determine exactly why or by how much. This made it nearly impossible to develop countermeasures or to improve their own armor-piercing ammunition. They were fighting blind, trying to solve a problem they couldn't fully define. The thermal imaging gap was even more troubling from a strategic perspective. Soviet military doctrine for a potential war against NATO in Europe had always assumed that certain conditions would level the technological playing field. Night operations, smoke screens, and weather conditions were supposed to reduce visibility for everyone, which would favor Soviet numerical advantages. If NATO forces could see clearly in all those conditions while Soviet forces were blind, then entire sections of Soviet war plans became unworkable. The implications were staggering. Soviet tank forces were designed to operate in massive formations, relying on coordinated mass attacks to overwhelm NATO defenses. But if NATO forces could detect Soviet formations at 3,000 meters in any weather condition and engage them before Soviet forces could even see their enemy, then Soviet numerical superiority became irrelevant. The tanks would be destroyed before they could bring their numbers to bear. Soviet military leadership faced an uncomfortable reality. They couldn't produce thermal imaging systems at the scale needed to equip their vast tank forces. Soviet semiconductor industry had focused on military applications like missiles and radar, not on the kind of advanced sensors needed for vehicle-mounted thermal sights. Attempts to reverse-engineer captured Western thermal systems had produced prototypes, but these were expensive, difficult to manufacture, and far inferior to Western equivalents. Mass production was simply not feasible with Soviet industrial capabilities. Even if they started an urgent development program immediately, it would take years, perhaps a decade, to close the gap, and during that time the gap would likely widen as Western technology continued to improve. The armor problem was equally intractable. Soviet military industry could produce composite armor. They had their own versions that provided protection superior to steel, but they apparently couldn't match the effectiveness of the M1A1HA package, and they definitely couldn't do it while keeping tanks at the T-72's relatively low production cost. Soviet tank doctrine was built on the assumption that they could produce 3 or 4 tanks for the cost of one American tank. If they had to match American armor protection and American optics, that cost ratio would change dramatically. They would have to produce fewer, more expensive tanks, which meant they would lose the numerical superiority that their entire doctrine was based on. Some Soviet military analysts reached a grim conclusion in their post-Gulf War assessments. They had been designing weapons and doctrine to fight the last war, or maybe the war before that. They had assumed that tank combat would remain fundamentally similar to how it had been in World War II or in the Arab-Israeli wars of the 1970s. They had assumed that technology would provide incremental advantages, but wouldn't fundamentally change the nature of armored warfare. They had been catastrophically wrong. The Americans had changed the rules. They had created a form of armored warfare where the side with superior sensors and fire control could destroy enemy forces at ranges where the enemy couldn't even detect them, let alone fight back. It wasn't warfare. It was execution. And Soviet forces, if they fought NATO under similar conditions, would suffer the same fate as the Iraqis. The timing made this realization particularly bitter. The Gulf War ended in late February 1991. The Soviet Union would dissolve in December of the same year. Soviet military leadership had less than 9 months to contemplate the obsolescence of their armored forces before the state they served ceased to exist. There was no time to close the technology gap, no resources to fund a massive modernization program, and no political will to admit the scale of the problem publicly. The lies that Soviet propaganda had been telling client states about the effectiveness of Soviet weapons were now exposed. But they weren't just lies told to foreigners. They were lies that Soviet military doctrine had been built on. The whole system had believed its own propaganda. The Iraqi experience at Medina Ridge became a case study in what happens when doctrine based on outdated assumptions meets technology that has fundamentally changed the battlefield. Soviet tank doctrine had assumed that visibility conditions would affect everyone equally. Thermal imaging broke that assumption. Soviet doctrine had assumed that at close range, firepower would decide engagements. Advanced armor broke that assumption. Soviet doctrine had assumed that numerical superiority and defensive positions would provide significant advantages. Long-range precision fire broke that assumption. Every foundational principle of Soviet armored warfare had been invalidated in a single 3-hour engagement. The human cost of these doctrinal failures was measured in burning tanks and dead crews scattered across the Kuwaiti desert. Iraqi tank commanders who had trusted Soviet training, Soviet equipment, and Soviet doctrine paid with their lives. Many of them probably never understood what killed them. They died in explosions that came without warning, from an enemy they never saw, firing weapons they didn't know could reach them. Some who did see American tanks before they died had the additional horror of watching their best shots bounce harmlessly off enemy armor, followed by the certain knowledge that the return shot would not bounce off their armor. They had approximately 2 seconds to understand that they had been betrayed by the doctrine they had trusted, and then they were dead. The propaganda that had mocked American over-engineering and praised Soviet simplicity didn't need to be refuted with words. It was refuted with results. Soviet doctrine had claimed that simple, mass-producible tanks operated by basic crews would be sufficient against sophisticated Western technology. The test of that claim was conducted in the desert of Kuwait and Iraq. 186 Iraqi tanks destroyed versus 0 American tank losses to enemy fire. That was the refutation. That was the answer. Soviet propaganda had spent decades laughing at American complexity, at American obsession with technology, at American unwillingness to embrace brutal simplicity. The laughter died in the sandstorm at Medina Ridge. The complexity didn't laugh back. It didn't need to. It simply fired. If you found this story fascinating, hit that subscribe button to dive deeper into untold military history. Drop a like if this changed how you see Cold War technology, and leave a comment below. What other military myths do you want us to expose? Your support keeps these stories coming.